everyone, today we're looking at 3.3 cultural patterns. Our learning objectives are to explain how landscape features and land and resource use reflect cultural beliefs and identities, and to explain patterns in landscapes of language, religion, ethnicity, and gender. Our tidbit of the day is that in Japan you can hire a handsome man to watch sappy movies with you and wipe away your tears. So, identity in space. I want you to think about for a minute how who you are as an individual affects your space. So what artifacts do you have or keep around you? And think like your books, photos, artwork, decorations, technology. So you can see my space behind me. I have like a plant and I have things up on my walls, and my walls are pink, and this is stuff that is affected by who I am as a person. On the broader scale, neighborhoods tend to reflect the residents' cultural attitudes, so places like churches, shops, restaurants retain oftentimes ties to the culture of origin, especially in places like ethnic neighborhoods, even while they function in the new culture. And we see the same idea in non-ethnic neighborhoods as well. Neighborhoods in general all reflect unique sets of beliefs and attitudes about the people who live there. This extends to the home. So homes may reflect cultural beliefs or identities. So if we are in a space that has a lot of churches, often we'll find things like crosses in the home. If we are Buddhist, we may build gardens that reflect Buddhist principles of peace, serenity, goodness, and respect for all living things. You may even have a Buddha statue that would face your home because that is intended to bring good fortune, prosperity. Communities with large Muslim populations will have mosques, halal butchers, halal restaurants, and shops. And Tarpon Springs, Florida, so one particular example, has a huge Greek American community. There are a lot of Greek restaurants, bakeries, there are Greek Orthodox churches, and they even have an annual Greek festival. These images are all from Tarpon Springs, Florida. So we have St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church, we have stained glass windows, we have a Greek Orthodox shrine, and we have Greek restaurants as well. So our land and resource use often is going to reflect our values. If we value resources, wildlife, our land, then that may result in sustainable living. So for example, the Inupiat in Alaska, they hunt whales, but they hunt whales for subsistence living, not for commercial purposes. This image in the middle, they have 3 successful whale hunts, and in what is considered a good year, they may take 10 for a community. So 10 is a relatively small number of whales overall, and they're only taking as much as they need. In this way, they maintain the population of whales and of people. They ensure a future harvest and the survival of the people and the culture. So looking at gendered spaces, and particularly we're going to think about women in gendered spaces. So these are spaces that are possibly designed and deliberately incorporated into the landscape to accommodate gender roles. They may exist in the home, in workplaces, or in public areas. They can be supportive and positive, or they can be restrictive. They are historically more restrictive for women than for men. In some countries, there are different laws in place for genders, and there may be practices and beliefs that also influence how men and women use land. So in Kenya, for example, less than 2% of land deeds are held by women, but women run 3/4 of the farms in Kenya. And if you look down in the corner, we have one example of a gendered space in a barber shop. Very frequently, these are only used by men and mostly employ men. So in general, women tend to place more value in safety. They are more likely than men to seek out well-lit parks and parking spaces. If available, they have women's only buses and train cars in places like Mexico City, in Delhi, in India, in Japan, and in Sao Paulo. There are some regions in India where women are discouraged from sharing viewpoints openly with men. So they created something called the Zanana Bagh. This is a women's park, and it exists to give women safe spaces to gather for prayer, to openly discuss religion, politics, and environmental issues. In Saudi Arabia, they only recently have allowed men and women to use the same entrances to go into restaurants and to eat at the same table, so without segregating screen dividers for the different genders. In Egypt, women are largely limited to serving men in the household. So again, what we see most of the time is that women tend to be more restricted than men by gendered spaces, although sometimes they do exist for inclusivity or to create safe spaces. And if we look up here in the top corner, this is an example of a women's only train car in Japan. So looking at LGBTQIA plus spaces, we want to think about things like gender identity. So this is one's concept of the self as male, female, a blend of both, or neither. Mentefacts may factor into this identity, and identification and perception by society may profoundly affect how individuals participate in the society and shape the landscape. The more inclusive the society is, the more well perceived the people are, the more likely they are to have an influence and to participate in the society. The community generally celebrates diversity, pride, and individuality, and often will create safe spaces where members can go to feel accepted, to feel safe, and to have a sense of belonging. To kind of counter this, we see a lot of times gentrification, and this is not limited to these neighborhoods. This is not limited to LGBTQIA plus neighborhoods, but this is often a group that's affected by them. So gentrification is renovations and improvements conforming to middle-class preferences. It has driven up the demand for housing and the cost of living in the neighborhoods with more vulnerable populations, which includes LGBTQIA+, and people of color, which forces them out of the communities, removes them from affordable homes, and limits where they have access to. There's also something called a third space, and this is a term coined back in the 1980s that refers to communal spaces. So first place would be the home, second place would be the workspace, third place is communal spaces. And these are places for social interactions and are very important in communities because they give somewhere for people to see each other, to interact in a social setting where they can make friends, feel accepted, feel heard, and feel safe. Looking at a map of the world, so here we're looking at sexual orientation laws around the world in 2019, so very, very recently. The darkest blue means that people have legal constitutional protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation. So dark blue, places like Bolivia, Mexico, Sweden, Portugal. The medium blue means that they have broad protections. So they're pretty widespread. They're not constitutionally protected, but they're very noticeable and very inclusive. Places like Canada, Brazil, Angola, Australia, Mongolia, Finland, Norway, most of Europe. The light blue means that they have employment protections. So each one of these is a step down. They're losing something. So here we find these here in places like Greenland, Venezuela, Mozambique, Ukraine, Poland, and Thailand. The lightest blue that's almost white, so this right here, this is limited or uneven protections, and we find this in places like the United States, Argentina, the Philippines, and Japan. Then we start to get into the criminalization. So the beige is really the no protection, no criminalization, entirely neutral according to law. This is much of Central Africa and even some of Western Africa, China, India, Madagascar, Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Indonesia. The yellow is de facto criminalization. It's not legal, but it happens. Places like Egypt and Iraq. Orange means it's up to 8 years of imprisonment based on consensual same-sex acts. All of these are criminalization of consensual same-sex sexual acts between adults. So orange is up to 8 years of imprisonment. This is much of North Africa, Turkmenistan, Syria, Papua New Guinea, and the red is 10 years up to life in prison. So all of these parts in Eastern Africa, over here in Myanmar, in Malaysia, and in some of the islands and places in the Caribbean. And then finally, the darkest red is the death penalty. So consensual same-sex sexual acts between adults will result in the death penalty. And this is places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Mauritania, and a few more places throughout Africa and the Middle East in particular. Okay, that's it. So again, we are looking at how landscape features and land and resource use reflect cultural beliefs and identities, and explaining patterns in landscapes of language, religion, ethnicity, and gender. Particularly here, we're looking at ethnicity and gender, especially gender. So I want you to take a couple of minutes and describe an example of a gendered space for women. This can be positive or negative, but take a little bit of time to describe it. Then I want you to explain how educational institutions might further develop or create safe spaces for LGBTQIA+ students. And make sure you go back, review anything that you missed, read in your textbooks, and have a great day. Bye.